College life had a way of feeling like it was on repeat. Classes, assignments, late-night cramming sessions in the dorms, it all blended into a routine I couldn't seem to break. My roommate, Mark, had been on a roll lately, meeting people on dating apps and sharing his stories with too much enthusiasm. At first, I brushed off his suggestions to try it myself, but as the days blurred together, curiosity got the better of me. I downloaded the app on a Wednesday evening, scrolling aimlessly through profiles between study breaks. It felt strange at first, like shopping for something intangible. Then I saw Haley. Her profile was refreshingly simple: auburn hair, a bright, genuine smile, and a caption about loving horror movies and live music. She wasn't trying too hard, and that stood out. I swiped right, half expecting nothing to come of it. When the notification buzzed a match, I felt a small thrill of validation. Within minutes, she messaged me, and the conversation started effortlessly. We joked about cheesy horror tropes, traded favorite band recommendations, and talked about our majors. Mine, mechanical engineering, and hers, graphic design. It was nice, natural, like reconnecting with someone I already knew. By the end of the week, Haley suggested meeting in person. "There's this cozy bar downtown," she said. "You'll love it." I hesitated, staring at the screen for a while. Meeting someone from an app felt like stepping into uncharted territory. But she seemed genuine, and I couldn't ignore the excitement bubbling under my nerves. Friday night came, and I found myself walking into the bar she'd suggested. It was tucked away on a quiet side street, its warm lighting spilling out into the cool evening air. Inside, the hum of conversation mingled with faint music from an old jukebox in the corner. Haley was already there, waving from a corner booth. She looked just like her pictures, though there was an ease about her in person that photos couldn't capture. We fell into conversation quickly, talking and laughing over drinks. Haley had a sharp wit and a contagious laugh, but there was something about her that felt just slightly out of sync, an occasional glance at her phone, moments when her attention seemed to drift. I dismissed it as nothing. "You're even better company than I expected," she said, leaning in with a soft smile. "Want to keep this going? My apartment isn't far." The invitation came naturally, but my gut tensed. Something about it made me hesitate, but I quickly silenced my unease. It was just a short walk. What's the worst that could happen? "Sure," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Her apartment building was on the edge of downtown, worn and forgettable, the kind of place you wouldn't look at twice. The stairwell creaked as we climbed to the third floor, and Haley unlocked the door with a quick, practiced motion. "Come on in," she said, holding it open for me. The apartment was dim, its light bulbs casting a yellowish glow. The furniture was mismatched, and the faint scent of stale smoke hung in the air. "Make yourself at home," she said, walking ahead. But something about the room felt off. My unease grew as I stepped further in, the door clicking shut behind me. Then I heard it, a low cough coming from the darkness of the next room. The cough froze me in place. It wasn't Haley's. It was deeper, rougher, like it came from someone trying to clear their throat after years of smoking. My eyes darted toward the darkened doorway at the far end of the living room. Haley didn't flinch. She didn't even turn around. Instead, she walked over to a small table, grabbed her phone, and checked it. Her body language suddenly closed off, distant. "Is someone else here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though the tension in my chest made my words come out strained. Haley looked over her shoulder and gave me a smile that felt forced, like she'd rehearsed it. "Oh, don't worry. It's just my roommates. They're harmless." Harmless. The word felt heavy, wrong. The air in the apartment seemed thicker now, each second stretching into something unbearably long. My eyes scanned the room again, taking in the details I'd missed before. A pair of muddy boots sat near the door. A half-empty pack of cigarettes rested on the coffee table next to an ashtray overflowing with butts. None of it seemed like Haley. Before I could piece my thoughts together, a figure emerged from the darkened doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a faded hoodie. His face was rough, unshaven, with eyes that lingered on me too long. Another man followed, thinner but no less intimidating, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "Ethan, meet my friends," Haley said, her voice light, almost playful. But her expression betrayed her words. She wouldn't look at me, her eyes fixed somewhere just above my head. The tall man moved closer, his boots thudding against the floor. "You're the college kid, huh?" he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Smart guy, real smart." My mouth went dry. Yeah, I guess." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Good, we need someone smart." He glanced at Haley, who shifted uncomfortably before sitting down on the couch. The other man leaned against the wall, his posture casual, but his eyes were sharp, predatory. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly despite my attempt to sound firm. The tall man's grin widened. "Simple. You're gonna help us out. You're gonna move some stuff for us on campus. Nothing big, just a little business." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bag of white powder, holding it up like he was showing off a prized possession. "Are you serious?" My voice rose despite the knot tightening in my stomach. "I'm not doing that." The second man pushed off the wall, his movements slow but deliberate. "You don't get it, kid," he said, his tone colder. "You don't have a choice. You either work for us, or we make sure everyone knows about this little arrangement. And trust me, you don't want that." Haley stayed silent, her eyes glued to the floor. My head spun as the weight of their words sank in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't dare reach for it. The tall man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Think about it. You could make it easy, or we can make it real hard. Up to you." The door to the apartment felt miles away, but my mind raced for an escape. I had to get out of there before things got worse. But how? My breathing quickened as the second man stepped closer, his posture tense, like he was ready to pounce. Then I saw it. A window behind the couch cracked open just enough. My heart pounded as a plan began to form. It was risky, but it was all I had. I just needed to time it right. My palms were slick with sweat and my mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. The window behind the couch was my only chance. The room felt smaller now, the two men crowding the space, their stares heavy and unrelenting. Haley sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, refusing to meet my eyes. "Listen," I said, forcing my voice to steady. "This isn't me. I'm not into any of this. You've got the wrong guy." My heart pounded in my chest, the pressure almost unbearable. The tall man smirked. "That's the thing, college boy. You're perfect. No record, clean cut. Nobody would suspect you." He nodded toward the thinner man, who started to circle me, his eyes narrowing like a predator assessing its prey. "You don't have to make this difficult," the second man said, his tone dangerously calm. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, as if to emphasize his control. "Do what we say, and this ends fine for you." My brain screamed at me to move, to run, but my body felt paralyzed. They were too close, too strong. And then there was Haley. Her presence felt like an anchor, a reminder that this wasn't a random robbery. I'd been lured here. "Okay," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Just let me think for a second." The tall man chuckled, clearly amused by my desperation. He leaned back slightly, giving me just enough room to breathe. "Take all the time you need," he said, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. "But make it quick." My eyes flicked toward the window behind the couch. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it was open. The thin man noticed my glance and stepped closer. "Don't get any ideas," he warned, his grip tightening on my shoulder. "I need some air," I blurted, trying to sound panicked but innocent. This is too much. Please." The tall man rolled his eyes but waved dismissively. "Fine." Haley cracked the door for him. Haley stood, her movements stiff and reluctant. But instead of going to the door, she hesitated, glancing at me, her expression flickering with something. Remorse, fear, whatever it was, I didn't wait to figure it out. As Haley took a step forward, I shoved the thin man's arm off my shoulder and lunged for the couch. My foot caught the edge of the coffee table, sending a glass bottle clattering to the floor, but I didn't stop. I reached the window, yanked it open further, and dove through. The drop was farther than I anticipated, maybe 10 feet to the alley below. I landed hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but I forced myself up, adrenaline drowning out the agony. Behind me, I heard shouting, heavy footsteps pounding toward the window. I didn't look back. The narrow alley was dark, the air sharp with the smell of garbage and exhaust. I sprinted, each step sending jolts of pain up my leg, but I couldn't stop. My chest burned as I pushed forward, weaving through the maze of side streets until I reached the main road. I spotted a gas station ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the night. Stumbling inside, I collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. The clerk stared at me, wide-eyed, as I choked out, "Call the police. Please." The next hour was a blur, officers asking questions, my words tumbling out in fragments. They promised to check the apartment, but part of me knew they wouldn't find much. Those men were too smart to leave evidence behind. And Haley, I didn't know what her role was, but I doubted she'd still be there when they arrived. Back in my dorm that night, the silence felt suffocating. I stared at my phone, the app still open, Haley's smiling face staring back at me. With shaking hands, I deleted it, vowing never to trust a stranger behind a screen again. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. And every time I hear a cough in the distance, my heart stops, wondering if they've come back to finish what they started. Certainly. Here's chapter 1. When I moved into the small house on Birchwood Lane, I told myself it was a fresh start, a quiet place to settle into after the chaos of the past year, my divorce, leaving the city, and starting over. The house wasn't much, but it was mine, a single-story structure with a peeling white fence and a backyard that overlooked a patch of dense trees. It was enough for me to feel like I had space to breathe again. The neighborhood seemed ideal at first. Kids rode their bikes up and down the cul-de-sac, and neighbors exchanged casual waves as they passed by. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and distant barbecues, the kind of idyllic setting you only see in movies. I spent my evenings sitting on the porch with a cigarette, watching the day fade into night. It felt peaceful. That was until I noticed my neighbor. His house was directly across the street, and I had a 2-story structure with drawn blinds and an overgrown lawn that stood out in the otherwise pristine neighborhood. I'd never seen him during the day. In fact, the first time I caught sight of him was during one of my late-night porch sessions. It was just after midnight, and I was finishing my second cigarette when I saw the faint glow of headlights. His old sedan pulled into the driveway, and a man stepped out, carrying a large black sack slung over his shoulder. The sack was heavy enough to make him stagger slightly as he walked toward the front door. I watched, intrigued, as he disappeared inside without turning on any lights. A minute later, the headlights turned off and the street fell back into silence. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe he worked late hours or had an odd job that kept him out at night. But then it happened again. And again. Every night at nearly the same time, his car would pull into the driveway, and he'd carry another black sack into the house. Always alone. Always silent. I told myself I was imagining things, that there was nothing inherently strange about his routine. But something about it nagged at me, a quiet unease I couldn't shake. I started looking for excuses to stay outside longer, pretending to read or scrolling through my phone, just so I could catch glimpses of his nightly ritual. He never looked my way. Never seemed to notice me watching from the shadows of my porch. The neighborhood kids never played near his yard, and I overheard the occasional whisper from other neighbors about how weird he was. But nobody seemed to know him. Weeks passed, and I began to feel like I was living in a suspense movie. The questions swirled in my mind. What was in the bags? Why only at night? Why didn't he ever come out during the day? But I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. Maybe I didn't want it to be. Until one night when he brought in a bag that was larger than the others. Much larger. The bag that night was massive, much larger than the others I'd seen. It was unwieldy, and the man struggled as he dragged it from his car to the front door. I couldn't help but lean forward on my porch chair, my cigarette burning forgotten between my fingers. Something was different. The way he moved was slower, almost hesitant, as though he knew the size of the bag might draw attention. For the first time, I felt an undeniable urge to do something. Anything. I wanted to shout across the street, ask what was in the bag, maybe even confront him. But what would I say? That I'd been watching him for weeks, lurking in the shadows? No. I stayed silent, my heart racing as he disappeared inside once again, leaving the street in eerie stillness. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, saw the way his body strained to lift the bag. I imagined its contents, tools, maybe garbage, or something darker, something alive. By dawn, my curiosity had grown into an obsession. I needed answers. Over the next few nights, I began watching him more intently. I'd position myself in the dim light of my living room, peeking through the blinds as his car pulled into the driveway. The routine never changed. Midnight, the black sack, the silent trip inside. But he seemed more cautious now, glancing over his shoulder as though he could feel my eyes on him. It wasn't enough to just watch anymore. I needed to know where he went before he returned home with those bags. On the fifth night, I made my decision. I would follow him. I parked my car around the corner from my house, out of sight, and waited. The hours dragged by, and I questioned my sanity more than once. What was I hoping to find? What if I got caught? But when the familiar glow of his headlights cut through the night, all my doubts vanished. He was leaving. I started the engine and pulled out slowly, keeping my distance as he drove through the quiet neighborhood. His taillights were like distant beacons, guiding me as we turned onto a narrow road lined with trees. The deeper we went, the darker it became, the glow of the city disappearing behind us. After about 20 minutes, his car slowed and pulled into what looked like an old gas station. The building was decrepit, its sign faded and unreadable. A single light bulb flickered above the entrance, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He stepped out of the car, carrying another black sack. This time he walked with purpose, heading straight for the building. I parked farther down the road, my hands trembling as I killed the engine. The place was dead silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to forget the whole thing. But curiosity overruled fear. I crept closer, careful to stay in the shadows. When I reached the edge of the station's parking lot, I crouched behind an old rusted dumpster. From there, I had a clear view of the door. He opened it, disappeared inside, and then nothing. No movement, no sound. Minutes passed, and the silence became unbearable. I edged closer, heart pounding with every step. The door loomed in front of me now, its chipped paint and broken handle inviting me to look inside. I reached out, fingers brushing the cold surface, and then the sound of a car door slamming shattered the stillness. I whipped around, but the driveway was empty. His car was gone. I turned back to the door, only to find it locked. The faint flicker of the light above was the only indication that anyone had been there at all. I stood there frozen in place, staring at the locked door. The flickering bulb above me seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat, erratic and quick. The station's silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the occasional creak of the old structure. My mind raced with questions. How had he vanished so quickly? What was inside? And most importantly, what was I doing here, alone, at a place no one seemed to know existed? I stepped back, scanning the lot. The gas pumps were relics, their metal shells rusted and their hoses cracked, as though abandoned decades ago. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the pavement, reaching toward the faint moonlight. It was a place forgotten by time, yet here I was, chasing a mystery I hadn't fully understood. Every instinct told me to leave, but something about the station pulled me back. I circled the building, searching for another way in. The windows were either boarded up or coated in grime, so thick I couldn't see through. The air smelled of damp earth and faintly of something metallic. Blood? No, I shook the thought away. Maybe oil. It had to be oil. As I rounded the corner, I noticed faint tire marks leading away from the back of the building, disappearing into the woods. He had left quickly, but not before taking whatever or whoever he'd brought with him. My stomach churned at the thought, and for the first time, fear began to outweigh my curiosity. I hurried back to my car, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and gripped the wheel tightly, forcing myself to breathe. The station stood motionless in my rearview mirror as I drove away, its single flickering light slowly swallowed by the darkness. For days, I couldn't get the station, or my neighbor, out of my mind. I replayed the scene over and over, searching for clues in the smallest details. The bags, his movements, the eerie quiet of the station. Something wasn't right, but I was no closer to an answer. I avoided his house, refusing to so much as glance in its direction. I told myself I was done with this mystery. Then one morning, I woke to flashing lights outside my window. Red and blue danced across my walls as police cars swarmed my neighbor's house. I rushed outside, joining the other curious onlookers as officers led him out in handcuffs. His expression was blank, unreadable, as if he were a man who'd already resigned himself to his fate. The scene buzzed with activity. Detectives, forensics teams, neighbors murmuring in low tones. But the police were tight-lipped. No one seemed to know what he'd done, only that it was serious enough to warrant the heavy response. I overheard one officer mention evidence, but nothing more. The black sacks, I thought immediately, but I kept the idea to myself. The days that followed were a blur of speculation and half-heard rumors. Some said he'd been involved in something criminal, while others whispered darker theories. Bodies, rituals, unspeakable acts. The police said nothing, and his house remained cordoned off, a dark and silent reminder of the man who once lived there. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood settled back into its quiet rhythm. But for me, the unease lingered. One night, unable to shake the feeling, I drove out to the station. It looked the same, desolate, abandoned, its lights still flickering faintly like a dying heartbeat. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. As I sat in my car staring at the building, I realized the truth. I would never know what he'd been doing or why. The answers were locked away with him. Or perhaps they were here, buried in the dark corners of that station, waiting for someone foolish enough to uncover them. I turned the car around and drove home, but the feeling followed me. Even now, as I sit in my house and try to move on, I can't help but glance across the street at his empty house. The mystery remains, an open wound that refuses to heal. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I see a faint glow in his window. A flicker, just like the light at the station. I always thought living alone would be liberating. The small house I found on the outskirts of Seattle seemed perfect, modest, affordable, and tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of place where the hum of lawnmowers filled Saturday mornings, and the streets were lined with trees whose leaves fluttered like whispers in the wind. For the first time, I could breathe without sharing space, without compromise. The house was older, with creaky wooden floors and a kitchen that smelled faintly of pine cleaner. The windows were slightly warped, but they let in enough light during the day to make the rooms feel alive. Moving in was exhausting, but satisfying. My boxes, filled with books, clothes, and knickknacks, sat stacked in corners, waiting for their final places. I had envisioned a haven here, a retreat where I could finally settle into myself. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent them hanging pictures, rearranging furniture, and familiarizing myself with my new neighborhood. There were kids playing in yards and dog walkers who offered friendly nods as they passed. By the end of the week, the sense of belonging began to take root, though there was a strange undercurrent I couldn't quite place. At night, the house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of its aging structure. The silence felt heavier than I expected. On Friday evening, I came home from work to find a note. It was tucked neatly under the mat, written on plain white paper with delicate handwriting. "It's nice to see the house lived in again," it read. For a moment, I stood frozen on the porch, scanning the street for movement. Nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I took the note inside, convincing myself it was a kind gesture, maybe from a neighbor who had seen me moving in. Still, there was something unsettling about it. How it had been placed so carefully, the choice of words. Who had left it? And why not knock or introduce themselves? I decided it wasn't worth worrying about, though I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as I locked the door that night. The following days were uneventful, yet the note lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, diving into work and busying myself with decorating. By Sunday, I had almost forgotten about it, but a subtle shift had occurred, an awareness I hadn't had before. At night, I'd pause before turning off the lights, listening to the silence that pressed against the walls. And then, on Monday morning, I found another note. This one was more direct. "I see you." The second note was impossible to ignore. I stood on my porch, the cool morning air biting at my skin as I held the paper in trembling hands. "I see you." The words were smaller this time, written hurriedly, as if the writer had little time to spare. My eyes darted around the street, scanning the rows of houses for movement. Curtains hung still, yards were empty, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood remained undisturbed. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I locked the door behind me and stepped into the house. The coffee I'd been looking forward to now seemed irrelevant. My mind raced with questions. Who was doing this? Why? And how long had they been watching me? I spent the day in a haze, barely registering the emails and meetings at work. My boss's voice crackled over the phone, but I couldn't focus on his words. My thoughts were stuck on that note, the invasive chill of its meaning. By the time I returned home that evening, the feeling of unease had cemented itself deep in my chest. I decided to do something about it. Grabbing a piece of cardboard from an empty moving box, I wrote in bold black letters, "Stop leaving notes. I will call the police." I taped it firmly to my front door, the defiance giving me a fleeting sense of control. Surely this would be enough to deter whoever was playing this cruel game. But as night fell, the house felt different. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, and the faint creaks in the walls echoed louder than before. I left the lights on in every room and checked the locks twice before retreating to bed. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My bedroom window faced the street, and I found myself staring at it for hours, searching for movement in the darkness. The next morning, I woke to find the sign still taped to the door. Relief washed over me. Perhaps my warning had worked. I peeled it down and headed to work, convinced that this strange ordeal was behind me. But that evening, as I returned home, my stomach dropped. Another note. It was pinned to the door with a small nail, a deliberate act that felt more threatening than the ones before. The paper was the same, the handwriting unchanged. This time it read, "You can't stop me." My knees went weak as I pulled the note free and stepped into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. I called my father, my voice shaking as I recounted the events. He was calm, as he always was, and told me he'd come by in a few days to stay with me. "Whoever this is, they won't stand up to two of us," he reassured me. His words were a balm, but the unease in my chest remained. The days leading up to his visit passed in a blur. Every sound, every shadow outside felt magnified. I started leaving the lights on at night and double-checking every window. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a trap, and I was its prey. My father arrived on Friday afternoon, pulling into the driveway in his familiar truck. The sight of him stepping out, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor, made me exhale for the first time in days. I ran out to meet him, hugging him tightly. The weight of my fear momentarily lifted. "Let's get to the bottom of this," he said firmly as we stepped into the house. His presence brought a sense of security I hadn't felt in weeks. He inspected the notes I'd saved, holding each one as though they might reveal some hidden clue. "Whoever this is, they're trying to scare you. They're probably a coward who won't show their face once they realize I'm here." That night, we sat together in the living room, the air heavy with anticipation. My father stayed close, his protective instincts kicking in. Every sound outside drew his attention, his eyes flicking toward the windows. Hours passed, the tension in the house growing thicker as the night deepened. Around midnight, we heard it, faint footsteps on the porch. My father stood, motioning for me to stay back. He moved to the front door and peered through the peephole. A shadowy figure stood there, just out of the porch light's reach. My father swung the door open, startling the intruder. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice booming in the quiet night. The figure didn't move. For a moment, it stood frozen, its face obscured by a hood. Then, without warning, it bolted into the darkness. My father chased after it, but the figure was too fast. By the time he reached the edge of the driveway, the street was empty. He returned moments later, shaking his head in frustration. "It's like they disappeared," he muttered, "but they won't be back. Not after tonight." We locked the doors and sat in silence for a while, neither of us voicing what we both felt. The figure's silence, its swift escape. It all felt wrong, like there was more to this than just a prank or a stalker. The following morning, my father insisted I leave the house, at least for a while. "This place doesn't feel safe," he said. I didn't argue. We spent the day packing what I could fit into my car, leaving the rest for another time. By evening, I was driving away from the small house, my father following close behind in his truck. As I looked in the rearview mirror, the house stood still, its windows reflecting the fading sunlight. I felt a strange pull, as if it were watching me leave, as if it were alive. Weeks later, I settled into an apartment in a bustling part of the city, surrounded by the comforting noise of life. Yet every so often, I found myself glancing at my front door, half expecting another note to appear. The silence of that house still lingered in my mind, its secrets buried in its creaking floors and dark corners. Even now, I wonder who or what was watching me. And sometimes, late at night, I feel the same weight of unseen eyes as though I never really left. The nights in my apartment always began the same way. Quiet, still, with the faint hum of the radiator breaking the silence. It wasn't much, this one-bedroom unit in an old building on the outskirts of town, but it was mine. The creaky floorboards and dim lighting gave it a certain charm, or at least that's what I tried to believe. That night, like so many others, I sat at my small desk by the window, sketchpad in hand, trying to finish an illustration before my deadline. The dim glow of my desk lamp barely cut through the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. My tea had gone cold hours ago, but I was too focused to notice. The stillness of the apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing against me like a second skin. The nightmares had started a week ago. The first one jolted me awake, gasping for air. In the dream, a dark figure loomed at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its long, clawed fingers reached toward me, and I swore I could hear it whispering my name. The memory of its rasping voice sent chills down my spine even now. I told myself it was just stress, but the dreams persisted. Each night the figure came closer. Each night I woke with my heart pounding and my sheets damp with sweat, and then there were the scratches. At first, I thought I'd scratched myself in my sleep, maybe from kicking the sheets or brushing against the wooden frame of the bed. But these marks were too deliberate. 3 parallel lines on my calf, faint but unmistakable. The next morning, 2 more scratches appeared, slightly deeper. They were starting to look less like accidents and more like something intentional. I tried to explain it all away. Stress, insomnia, and overactive imagination. But the little things added up, like how my bedroom door would be slightly open in the morning, though I always made a point to close it before bed. Or how I sometimes heard faint creaks in the middle of the night, even though I lived alone. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Old buildings make noises. Drafts push doors open. That's all it was. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My apartment no longer felt like a safe haven. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. That night, I finally gave in to exhaustion. I turned off my lamp, crawled into bed, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The ticking clock on my nightstand was the only sound as I closed my eyes and tried to ignore the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought with it the dream. The dream felt more vivid than ever. I was in my bed, but the air in the room was suffocatingly thick. The shadows along the walls seemed to move, twisting and curling like smoke, and there it was, at the foot of my bed. The creature. Its glowing eyes pinned me in place as it leaned closer, impossibly long claws scraping against the floor. It whispered my name in a guttural rasp that made my skin crawl. I woke up with a start, heart pounding in my chest. My room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. For a moment, I stayed frozen, trying to convince myself it was just another nightmare. But then I felt it, a sharp sting on my leg. I threw back the covers and stared in disbelief. 3 fresh scratches ran along my shin, deep enough to draw blood. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scrambled out of bed. I turned on the light, searching the room for anything that might explain what was happening. The door was open again. Not wide, just a crack, but enough to make my stomach drop. I knew I had closed it before going to sleep. I always did. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch in the living room, every light in the apartment turned on. I didn't dare go back into the bedroom, not after what I'd seen. By morning, exhaustion and fear had worn me down, but I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure it out. That day, I bought a lock for my bedroom door and installed it immediately. It felt like a small comfort knowing I could at least keep the door secure at night. I even set up an old webcam on my desk, pointing toward the bed. If something was happening while I slept, I wanted to know. The first few nights passed uneventfully. The dreams were still there, but the lock on the door held and the scratches stopped. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it all, my mind playing tricks on me from too many sleepless nights. But then, on the fourth night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like the gentle creak of wood shifting under pressure. My eyes darted to the door. The lock was still in place, but the sound wasn't coming from there. It was closer, coming from under the bed. My blood ran cold. I lay still, barely breathing, straining to hear. The sound came again, a soft scraping noise followed by a muffled rustle. I felt the weight of dread settle over me, pinning me down as I debated what to do. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I reached over to the nightstand and grabbed my phone. The screen's glow cut through the darkness, and I used it as a flashlight, angling it toward the edge of the bed. My hands trembled as I leaned over, heart pounding in my chest. The space beneath the bed was empty. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me. But then I noticed something. The scratches on the wooden frame, they were fresh, jagged lines carved into the wood. My stomach churned as I stared at them, realizing they hadn't been there before. That's when I heard it again, a faint, guttural whisper. My name. The whisper sent a jolt through my body. My phone slipped from my trembling hand and landed softly on the carpet. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my throat, straining to hear the noise again. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came the faintest creak. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor as I bolted to the light switch. The room was suddenly bathed in a warm, artificial glow, but it did nothing to comfort me. I stared at the bed, at the freshly carved scratches on the frame. My mind raced. Was I imagining things? Could I still be dreaming? But the sting of my nails digging into my palms told me I was awake. I needed to know. Whatever it was, whatever had been haunting me, I couldn't live like this anymore. Slowly, I dropped to my knees, every nerve in my body screaming to stop, to leave, to run. But I didn't. My hand moved cautiously toward the edge of the bed, and I gripped the fabric of the bedspread tightly. With one swift motion, I lifted it. For a second, I saw nothing but the shadows under the bed. But then, my eyes adjusted. There was something there. Someone. A man. Thin, pale, his body contorted in the cramped space. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, staring directly at me. His face was gaunt, his lips cracked and twisted into a grimace. He didn't move, didn't flinch, and as though he'd been expecting me to find him. My scream lodged in my throat, unable to escape as I stumbled backward, knocking over the nightstand in the process. The man crawled out from under the bed with slow, deliberate movements. He rose to his feet, towering over me, his breath ragged and shallow. His clothes were filthy, tattered beyond recognition, and his fingernails, long and jagged, were stained with dried blood. Why? I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. My back hit the wall, and I felt the panic rising as he stepped closer. "You weren't supposed to wake up," he whispered, his voice raspy and chillingly calm. His head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me. I reached blindly for anything I could use to defend myself, my hand closing around the broken lamp from the nightstand. With a surge of adrenaline, I swung it at him, the base connecting with a sickening thud. He staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he let out a low, guttural laugh that made my stomach turn. I didn't wait for him to recover. I shoved past him and bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My shaking hands fumbled with the lock before I remembered he'd been unlock it. I didn't stop to think. I ran out of the apartment, barefoot and terrified, until I reached the street. When the police arrived, I was barely coherent, clutching a blanket a kind neighbor had draped over my shoulders. I told them everything, the man under the bed, the whispers, the scratches. They searched the apartment thoroughly, but when they emerged, their expressions were grim. "There's no one in there," the officer said, though his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "But we found evidence, scratches, signs someone's been living there. We'll investigate further." I moved out the next day, unable to set foot in that apartment again. But even now, in my new home, I can't shake the feeling. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up and swear I hear it again, the faint creak of floorboards. And once, just once, I found fresh scratches on the wooden frame of my new bed. The day I got the toy, it was the happiest I'd been in weeks. It was a bright red robot, about the size of a football, with wheels on the bottom and lights that blinked in different colors. It could play music, spin around, and even talk in a high-pitched robotic voice. "Hello, friend," it chirped the first time I turned it on, its lights flickering like fireworks. My dad had bought it as a surprise, saying he'd found it on sale at the local toy store. I named it Robbie. Robbie quickly became my favorite thing in the house. I'd roll it across the carpet, watch it spin in circles, and laugh as it bumped into walls and kept trying to move forward. At night, I placed it carefully on the shelf next to my bed, where it would sit silent and still until morning. It felt comforting, like having a friend watch over me as I slept. The first time something strange happened, I barely noticed. It was late, and I was half asleep when I heard a faint click. I opened my eyes to see Robbie's lights blinking softly, cycling through blue, green, and red. I frowned. I was sure I'd turned it off before bed. My dad had warned me to save the batteries, so I always made sure to switch it off. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and reached for the toy. It was cold to the touch, unmoving. The lights stopped as soon as I picked it up, leaving me staring at the dark, lifeless shell of Robbie in my hands. I turned it over and checked the switch. It was already off. The next morning, I told my dad what happened. He laughed, saying it was probably just a glitch. "These things are made cheap," he said, ruffling my hair. "Don't worry about it." I tried to brush it off, but that night, the same thing happened. This time, I was wide awake when I heard it, a faint whirring noise, followed by a soft, mechanical voice. "Hello, friend." The sound sent a chill down my spine. My room was dark except for the dim streetlight filtering through the curtains, but I could see Robbie on the shelf, its lights flickering erratically. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the toy. It didn't move either, but the lights blinked for a full minute before fading out. I finally gathered enough courage to get up, grab Robbie, and shove it into the closet. I didn't want to look at it anymore. The following day, I avoided the toy entirely. My dad noticed and asked why I wasn't playing with Robbie. I mumbled something about being busy with homework, and he let it go. But that night, the whirring sound returned. It was louder this time, and when I opened my eyes, Robbie wasn't on the shelf. It was on the floor, near the foot of my bed, its lights glowing faintly in the dark. I stared at Robbie on the floor, its faint lights blinking like distant fireflies in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of it. I was sure I had shoved the toy into the closet the night before. The door to the closet was still closed, yet there it was, on the floor, unmoving, but somehow alive. "Dad?" I whispered, barely audible, as if speaking louder would somehow make things worse. I waited, straining to hear any sign that he might be awake down the hall. But the house was silent, the kind of heavy silence that made every creak and groan of the walls feel amplified. Robbie's lights flickered again, snapping me back at the moment. I wanted to get out of bed, to run to my dad's room, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stayed frozen under the covers, my eyes locked on the toy, half expecting it to start rolling toward me. It didn't move, but the blinking lights seemed almost deliberate, like they were watching me. The next morning, I ran to the kitchen and told my dad everything. "It moved by itself," I insisted, my voice shaky and urgent. "I put it in the closet, but it was on the floor when I woke up." He looked at me, his face softening into a smile. "Michael, toys don't move by themselves. Maybe you were sleepwalking. You probably knocked it off the shelf without realizing." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I knew I hadn't been sleepwalking. I had seen it, clear as day, or rather clear as the dim glow of Robbie's lights in the middle of the night. That evening, my dad decided to test the toy. He turned it on, letting it roll across the living room floor while it chirped, "Hello, friend," and spun in circles. It seemed normal, harmless even. "See? Nothing to be afraid of," he said, handing it back to me. I nodded reluctantly and carried Robbie back to my room, but instead of putting it on the shelf, I shoved it back into the closet and locked the door. I wasn't taking any chances. That night, I woke up to the sound of something rolling. The soft whir of wheels on carpet sent shivers down my spine. My eyes snapped open, and there it was. Robbie was in the doorway, its lights blinking erratically, casting faint colored shadows across the room as it slowly rolled toward my bed. I couldn't breathe. The toy stopped halfway into the room, as if waiting for me to react. I sat up, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the whirring sound. "Dad!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. "Dad, come here!" Seconds later, I heard the heavy footsteps of my dad rushing down the hall. He threw the door open, his eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" "It's Robbie," I cried, pointing toward the toy. But when we both looked, it wasn't moving anymore. It sat motionless in the center of the room, its lights off, as if nothing had happened. My dad sighed and walked over to pick it up. "Michael, it's just a toy. Look." He pressed the switch, but nothing happened. The toy didn't light up, didn't roll, didn't make a sound. He turned it over in his hands, shaking his head. "The batteries are probably dead." I wanted to argue, to tell him what I'd seen, but the words stuck in my throat. He placed Robbie back on the shelf and patted my shoulder. "Get some sleep, buddy. You've got an active imagination, that's all." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Robbie's blinking lights and the sound of its wheels moving across the carpet. Deep down, I knew this wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong with that toy. Something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I was exhausted. Dark circles hung under my eyes and my chest felt tight from hours of holding my breath, listening for any sound that might come from Robbie. I didn't touch the toy, didn't even look at it as I got dressed for school. I left my room without a word, hoping that ignoring it might make everything go back to normal. When I got home that afternoon, I found my dad in the garage, working on a project. I hesitated for a moment before blurting out, "Can we get rid of Robbie?" He glanced up from his tools, his brow furrowing. "Michael, it's just a toy. What's really going on?" I tried to explain again, but it sounded ridiculous, even to me. A toy moving on its own, blinking lights when the batteries were dead? He didn't believe me. I could see it in his face. But then, as if sensing my frustration, he sighed and said, "All right, let's test it one last time." That evening, we sat in my room with Robbie between us. My dad opened the battery compartment to show me it was empty. "See? No batteries," he said, shaking the hollow plastic shell. "It can't move on its own." He set it down on the carpet and crossed his arms. Now we wait. I wanted to argue that it only happened at night, but that the tension in his face kept me quiet. Minutes passed in silence, the room growing darker as the sun set. I stared at Robbie, daring it to prove me right, but nothing happened. Finally, my dad stood up, his expression tired. "See, there's nothing to..." Before he could finish, a faint whirring sound filled the room. My dad froze mid-sentence. We both turned to look at Robbie, which had started to roll slowly across the carpet. Its lights blinked erratically, casting eerie colors on the walls. "What the..." My dad's voice trailed off, his face pale. The toy stopped abruptly, as if it knew we were watching. My dad knelt down, picking it up gingerly, his eyes scanning it like he was searching for a logical explanation. "This isn't possible," he muttered, turning it over in his hands. "It's real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I told you." My dad didn't say anything for a moment. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he stood and stormed out of the room. "Stay here," he barked over his shoulder. I followed him to the garage, too scared to be left alone. He grabbed a hammer from his workbench and placed Robbie on the concrete floor. "This ends now," he said, raising the hammer high before bringing it down with a sickening crack. The toy's plastic shell shattered, scattering wires and shards across the floor. Its blinking lights flickered one last time before going dark. My dad swept the pieces into a trash bag and carried it outside to the curb. "It's gone," he said firmly, as if saying it aloud would make it true. "No more Robbie." That night I slept better, but the events of the day lingered in my mind. The sound of Robbie's wheels, the way it moved without batteries, it was burned into my memory. Even with the toy destroyed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. A week later, I found myself in my room after school, trying to convince myself everything was fine. I opened my closet to grab a hoodie, but as the door creaked open, I froze. On the wooden floor of the closet, just barely visible in the fading light, were faint, fresh scuff marks, like the tracks of wheels. My breath hitched, and for a moment I thought I heard it again. A faint, robotic whisper as if coming from deep inside the house. "Hello, friend."